This show was recorded in Narm, Melbourne, Australia, where the traditional custodians include the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I'm Trip Collins, and this is Book Science, the podcast that explores how the best science books are written and why they matter. Today, I'm bringing you a discussion with Duane Hamacher. Duane is an associate professor of cultural astronomy in the Astro 3D Center of Excellence in the School of Physics at the University of Melbourne in Melbourne, Australia. Duane is a cultural astronomer. He works directly with Indigenous communities, building connection and understanding of the complementary nature of Western astronomy and Indigenous sky knowledge. Duane has worked with Miriam elders for over a decade to document the astronomical knowledge and traditions of the Eastern Torres Strait Islanders, and with other First Nations communities across Australia and across the world. We talk about Duane's book called The First Astronomers, How Indigenous Elders Read the Stars. The First Astronomers is thus far the culmination of his work and was co-written with many elders and elder knowledge holders, including Giller Michael Anderson, John Barsa, David Boson, Ron Day, Segar Passy, and Nalo Tapham. We discuss a number of topics, including indigenous knowledge systems, meteorites, variable stars, and working with Aboriginal knowledge holders. I love this book, and I've read it several times, each time getting more out of it. I really hope you enjoy this conversation with Duane Hamacher. So I have to tell you a little story before we get into the contents of the book. I was scrolling through the Libby app. It's like the public library app at the Melbourne Public Library. And I was in like the nonfiction science section, and then boom, this orange cover pops in, and it just caught my eye. I mean, the cover art is just amazing. It works on purely a surface level. But over the course of reading the book, of course, you discover it's a painting, and the painting contains these deep cultural knowledge and representations of cultural knowledge. And I think at some point later, hopefully we'll touch on that. So the art was the first thing. And then there was the title. So it was The First Astronomers, as in the astronomy of the First Nations peoples. But also like literally first, as in the first people to develop knowledge systems that incorporated astronomical observations. And I think in some cases, it first also refers to what we call priority in science. So the fact that there are astronomical phenomena first observed and described by indigenous people long before our traditions in Western science. So this was titled with, many layered meanings. And yeah, and after reading it, I discovered not only are we currently on the same continent, but our offices were literally within walking distance to each other. And then, of course, I audited your class where we go through the ideas in the book in detail, which was really an incredible experience. And so that's my story of finding the book. But I'd like to start by kind of getting in your words. What is this book all about?
Well, this book is about 10 years in the making, actually almost 15 years in the making now. It all started off when I came to Australia 21 years ago as a study abroad student. I went to Macquarie University in Sydney and had an amazing experience. But at the time, I'd asked somebody about Aboriginal astronomy because I was doing my undergraduate degree in astrophysics. And the response I got was very dismissive. And it was very much, oh, silly American, what are you talking about? Aboriginal people don't have any astronomy. Ugh, don't you know any better? I remember being quite taken aback by that and being like, what are you talking about? And at the time, I didn't think too much of it. I thought it was a weird response that I got the few times I asked about it, but, whatever. And then I came back a couple of years later to do grad school, to study astrophysics, and I got sort of drawn back to that question. Like, why is it that when we talk about astronomy and we talk about Aboriginal culture, people think they're two different worlds that don't belong together at all? And I started looking into it, and it didn't take much effort, really, to just see how much science was embedded within the knowledge of astronomy by Aboriginal people. And whenever I would ask about that, I'd still keep getting these dismissive responses. And I thought, well, maybe this is something that interests me more, actually, than astrophysics does. So I decided to pursue that and did a PhD in that area, unpacking the science behind the star knowledges, because that's something that indigenous cultures of the world, especially here in Australia, are not given any credit for. The idea they would have science just makes people scoff, and I find that absurd. So, I began working. My first academic position was at the University of New South Wales, working with Professor Martin Nakata. So Martin Nakata is a Torres Strait Islander, and at the time he was the director of the Indigenous Center there, and he offered me my very first job. And we sat down together and we did a strategic plan of the next 10 years, to build up the field of Indigenous astronomy. What are we going to do? How are we going to do it? What's the timeline going to be? Get some major grants, start publishing, start getting the word out. And the book was one of those items in that list. Like, here's a culmination of what we're going to do. So that book was a long time in the making, and it was certainly a long time in the writing because I was doing it mostly over COVID. And it was one of those projects that I loved, but absolutely almost did my head in while I was trying to do it, especially during COVID. But at the end, when I got that first paper copy in my hands at home, when I opened the letter, which had been sent to my neighbor across the hall, they found me on Facebook and said, "Are you Duane Hamacher? Do you live in this building?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'm in this apartment." And like literally opened my door and he's right there across the hall. Opened it up and there was the first copy of the book, and it was very rewarding. But it was really that emphasis on what is the science behind the star knowledge. And as a scientist, as an astronomer, it gave me a perfect opportunity to really deep dive into that.
Yeah, you talked a little bit about your mentor, who is a Torres Islander. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of getting buy-in from Indigenous elders, many of whom you credited as co-authors on this project? And I imagine this was sort of key from the beginning.
It always was. I mean, when you're going to be looking at the knowledge of a community or a group, you work with the elders or the knowledge holders. Now, it's easy to go through and do, as I did with my PhD, you do all the work on published literature, which is predominantly Western, early colonists in Australia, other ethnologists and anthropologists and linguists, and sometimes Farmer Bob, who would be publishing or writing information about Aboriginal people and their relationship to the stars. In many cases, even in newspapers. You'd be surprised how much knowledge and information I got from newspapers. But you always have to acknowledge the severe limitations in that and challenges with accuracy and things like that. But part of the way through my PhD, I met a local elder in Sydney named Les Bursell. He was a Darawal elder. And he took me under his wing. And he was super supportive. He was somebody that, gave me a lot of great advice, gave me great direction. I sat with him many times for many hours, and we would go out on country. He lived down the south part of Sydney. We would go to Royal National Park, and he'd be showing me rock art sites and telling me what things meant. And as you do as a non-Indigenous person and as a non-Australian in this space, you're working your way through it. And sometimes you're going to go down the wrong pathway or say or do something stupid. They're there to correct you and put you back in line. And it was a really wonderful experience having that kind of guidance and mentorship. And then when I began working in my academic position at UNSW, Martin Nakata was and remains a very powerful mentor for me and an ally. Somebody who's always been very supportive. Being a non-Indigenous person working in this space doesn't always go very nicely. People can misinterpret what you're doing or assume you're not doing it for the right reasons. And it's good to have those kinds of people in your corner to help guide you and make sure that things are being done right. Of course, that's always been my goal here. And then working with other elders, in the Torres Strait, became quite close with a few of the elders in particular. Uncle Alo Tapim, the person I was most close to, and he trained in linguistics at the Batchelor Institute, and he grew up with Meriam Mir. That's the local Indigenous language in the Eastern Torres Strait, the only Papuan language of Australia, actually. He grew up with that as a first language. And, he was a great guiding force for all of that. And he helped me connect with a lot of the other elders and, became this situation where when it came time to publish the book, I knew I wanted to include the elders as authors. I've done that on academic papers, and that's been fine. But, how do you do it on a book? Well, I told my publisher I wanted to include them as co-authors. She said, "Oh, great. How many do you have?" I said, "About 85. She said, "Sorry, can't do that. It has to be 6. I'm like, 6? Why only 6? She says, "Well, the trade book industry, you can only have a maximum of 7 authors. So you and 6 others." So I chose the 6 elders that had worked the closest with me over time and the most work with. There were many who I acknowledge in the book, of course, but I couldn't put as little co-authors. And they do tend, well, don't tend to be, they are all male. Just tends to be the protocol when you go working in communities. In general, they're not going to send me off to talk to all the aunties. I did talk with women elders, and they're discussed in the book and things. But when it came time for me to pick who those 7 were, those were the 7 that I picked. And it was a really great opportunity to be able to work with the communities there and showcase their knowledge on a global stage. And there's stuff from all around the world in that book. It's not just the Torres Strait or even just Australia. But 5 of those elders are from the Torres Strait, because that was the main focus of much of that work that I was doing. But the great thing about it is the parallels between what they do in the Torres Strait and what other communities do around the world are so remarkably close. It didn't matter what they're talking about. They're the same communities in the Arctic or in the rainforests or in the desert or wherever. Very, very similar types of knowledge in the way that was used. So it was a great way to showcase not only their knowledge, but to see how it connects with other cultures around the world.
Yeah, I remember this was something you talked about in class, is that indigenous knowledge systems are sort of like a local application. So while the specifics might be different from one place to another, the way that they integrate a holistic knowledge system is very similar, which sort of resulted in similar stories, similar observations, different places by indigenous people around the world.
It comes down to the science as well. The reason those knowledges do that is because they're based on the laws of physics,
Right.
the observation of the natural world. The laws of physics apply everywhere. So when you see a particular kind of phenomenon that has an application, it's going to, there might be slight variations that might be geographic or related to the local climate or weather, but at the foundational level, it's the same science, and that's the beauty of it.
Did you find that they were motivated to get some of their knowledge into a book like this that would appeal to Western readers?
Yeah, so there was a few different reasons the communities were really adamant about this work being done. This wasn't just me going in and saying, I want to do this. It was them saying, look, this is what we want and what we need. So there's a couple of different levels. One of them is for cultural continuity in these communities. So they want to make sure that the knowledge is safeguarded and preserved for future generations. Now, the reason a book would be important, it's not just the book. It's the knowledge being shared and how that can be applied to local education and in curriculum. The communities in the Torres Strait, as with many parts of Australia, on these remote islands on Mare, which is where I spent most of my time, is on the order of 450 people on the island. There's a school that only goes to year 6, and it only has about 50 students, 50, 55 students in it. So when the students reach the age of around 12, and it's time for them to go on to year 7, they have to leave the island. They either go to one of 2 other islands where there's schools that go to year 12, or they go to the mainland. They stay with family or friends. And then when they come home, they're only on home during holidays or, maybe during the summer. And then when they reach the age where it's time to grow up and leave home, there aren't many economic opportunities on the islands. So majority of people go and live in the mainland. They're in Darwin, Cairns, Townsville, Brisbane, wherever. So what happens there is you have a bit of a rupture in the knowledge transmission. So a lot of the younger kids that are on the islands, they know a lot of stuff, right? But once they get to that age of around 12, then they're not around for most of the year. And as they go into adulthood, quite often they're not home very often. And like everybody else, they're on their phones, they're playing video games, they're doing stuff that all kids want to do, right? So that knowledge, like I said, there's that rupture. So elders are concerned that language, knowledge, and traditions aren't being passed down. So how do we help this? Well, going in and working with them to develop curriculum modules that'll be taught in the schools, working on developing videos and planetarium shows and books and all this kind of stuff helps with that. There's also the element of educating the world about their knowledge. And when I sat with some of the elders and We were talking about what I was doing and why I was doing it, because I go work with these communities by invitation, but sometimes they're kind of vaguely aware of what I do. And I said, well, I'm here to show that your knowledge has a lot of science behind it. And they're like, we've been saying that for decades, but nobody will listen. Like, well, that's why I'm here. I know it's an unfortunate situation that's how it is, but let's grab the bull by the horns, as we say, and get some creative outputs out of this and really showcase this on a global stage. And we've done that not only with the book, but even with documentaries. I mean, there was a Torres Strait Islander star dance, a shooting star dance that hadn't been performed on the island in a very long time that was featured in a Werner Herzog documentary, on it's an Aboriginal community that had their traditional knowledge shared in a Morgan Freeman documentary on National Geographic. So we're getting the stuff out there in a big way.
Yeah, that's amazing. You've done a lot of media, TV, podcasts. Maybe talk about the form of the book. Like, what makes a book like uniquely challenging and maybe uniquely rewarding? You said you were maybe a bit frustrated at some points during the process of putting it together. Maybe talk about that a little bit.
Writing in an academic fashion is very easy for me, anyway, because you're getting facts down on paper. But with this kind of a book, as we call it a trade book, what I mean by that is a popular book. It's not an academic book, you know. But that's a very different beast in and of itself. You're no longer just spouting facts out. You have to have a narrative. You have to have a story. Things have to link together. It has to keep people engaged. You've got to want to pick the book up and read it. And reading something in dry academies is not going to be what's going to keep people going. We publish academic research papers and journals for that reason. We go on to all the gory detail and show how and why everything works together and talk about the methodologies and the theoretical frameworks and all that stuff. But the average punter who wants to learn about this stuff doesn't care about that. And if they do, there's the academic papers. Have fun. They're freely available. And the papers I've put on, ResearchGate and academia.edu have been accessed 250,000 times, which has been great. But when you're writing a book like this, you've got to find something that's going to engage people. And that can be a double-edged sword. It's great to get people to see it and learn about it. You can't get too technical with it. And of course, there's a lot of people in the world who really want to focus on super technical details, and they're a bit disappointed when you can't cover everything. But I had to think, how can I create a narrative in this book? How can I get some themes that are going to continue throughout the whole book? And when you start off a narrative, what's it going to be? Is it, for me, it was sort of my personal journey coming into this space. But it's also, how can the story wrap up at the end? How can you bring it all together? And I found it to be a lot of fun to write, but also incredibly challenging. I think the real difficult part was trying to do it over COVID. I think everybody had the same problem with that. My ADHD didn't help out with that at all. But we managed to bring it all together. And I decided, to have three major themes in the book. It's the as is above, so is below. There's the we are a people of culture, but we're also a people of science, which is something Professor Nakata said and all the other elders reiterated. And the other theme is how you read your environment is going to dictate whether or not you're going to survive or not. So the title of the book, even though the words are spelled exactly the same, it's actually how elders read the stars. Which is challenging because you read and read, spelled the same way, and they both make perfect sense.
Uh-huh.
And one of the things I wanted to focus on with that is read implies something you did in the past but don't do. Or read is something you continue to do. But just that's English for you, right? That's the limitations we have in our language.
No, but the distinction is important, I think, because these aren't ancient knowledge systems. These are living knowledge systems. These are people practicing these techniques today. So sort of distinction speaks to that aspect of indigenous knowledge.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, they are, and they're ancient too, but they're still living, and that's a key thing. So it's great in that respect, but also get across a point that these knowledge systems evolve over time because they're describing the natural environment. The natural environment changes. We go through ice ages. We go through long-term climate change. The Earth spins on its axis and goes through, cycles of precession and nutation and all these factors that are going to impact not only what things look like, but when they're going to be visible, when the stars are going to rise or set, what your local environment and climate's going to be like. All of those things are linked together. So the idea that indigenous knowledges are somehow fixed and static in time is inaccurate. They're dynamic, as they have to be, but in the context in which they have to be. They're not going to change for the sake of changing. They're going to change because they need to. And they often incorporate new knowledge, new information. And we live in a time now where there's lots of new knowledge and information coming from all around the world. And these communities are phenomenal at integrating knowledge and information from other cultures and other ways of knowing that are useful.
Yeah, that was one of the more fascinating things to learn was when you're a scientist like you and I, in our tradition, the basic laws of physics are fixed, and science changes because we get better and better theories or more accurate descriptions or better observations. But bottom line of it is generally fixed. So it was sort of to learn how indigenous knowledge system works, which is the local application is the most important thing. And to think about the changes on Earth over deep time, of course their knowledge systems had to change. And not only that, I mean, like you were talking about astronomy, the stars in the sky that are visible changes over time that these cultures existed. So yeah, that was sort of a revelation to me. Just to return to the writing a little bit, I felt like the book was working on so many levels, and you touched on this. I mean, you're explaining indigenous knowledge systems, you're talking about astronomy, you want to write for a broad audience, and you're really diving into complex topics. How was it that you were able to strike a balance in all that? Because I felt like the book was really well balanced, given all the constraints you had. Not to mention that you had to be careful. There's boundaries about what you can share and what you can't share.
Yeah, exactly right. So, yeah, it became a challenge, and the feedback you give, whether it's directly from people or you just go on and see what the reviews are, of course, and it's the same challenge with the book is the same one I get when I'm teaching the class, like you were in. You get students from a science background who have some familiarity with this. Then you get students from an arts background or some other non-science area that have no idea, and it can be really difficult. Like, how much science do I include in here and how deep do I go into that? So at the end of the book, I did include a glossary of scientific terms that I used. Mm-hmm. I tried to not get too technical with it, but you've got to be technical enough with it. So reviews I've seen online, some of them are like, oh, we loved it. And some are like, we hated it. There was too much science. Some people didn't like the idea that I was jumping around the different cultures. But what I was trying to show there is when we look at a particular kind of phenomenon, I divvied all the chapters up. I kind of like the idea of doing these quirky little themes. All the chapters have star in the name, except for the moon. Couldn't figure out another way of doing that. Star knowledge, the nearest star, the wandering stars, twinkling stars, cataclysmic stars, variable, all that kind of stuff, falling stars. That gave a nice thread throughout. But how am I going to go into that detail and speak about all these things without getting too technical, but without ignoring them? So when you're looking at those kinds of phenomena, I talk about how similar they are by different cultures around the world. So looking at the way that Aboriginal people or Torres Strait Islander people would observe the way the stars twinkle and all the little properties that would change gave you something to read. It was like a text. You could read the stars if you knew how to interpret that and then figure out there's going to be seasonal change or rain, which you also tied into reading your local environment. So what are the clouds doing? What's the direction of the wind? What are the animals doing? Are the insects doing something weird? What does the moon look like? Is there a ring around it? All those can tell you things. And what I wanted to do is showcase that if you go to the Arctic, a totally different environment from anything you see, inland tundra of northern Alaska, compared to the tropical islands of the Torres Strait, remarkably similar applications of that same knowledge. So I like to be able to go to different places around the world and show how remarkably similar it was. And a lot of people like that, some don't, but that's just how it goes. You can't please everybody. But it was that was the idea that I had, is I wanted to showcase this knowledge, go into some depth about the science behind it, without getting too complicated, but I want people to really understand that this stuff is not easy. Like, this science isn't just naming some things or doing some very simple observations. There's some real deep scientific observation and deduction and knowledge that goes into this. And I really want to give people a taste of that.
Absolutely. You touched on the chapter titles. It's a personal narrative. It's your journey, but then you have this structure around the stars. How did that structure come about? Is that something you thought a lot about as you were planning out the book, or did that come later?
It came a bit later. The funny thing is, the book was not written in a linear front to back fashion at all. In fact, the introductory chapter was the last one that I wrote. The chapter on variable stars was the first one I wrote about 6 years prior to that, prior to it being published. I'd written a paper on that, and that's when I had the idea of doing a book because, like I said, you've got all the journal papers, and you need a somewhat technical audience to be able to read and understand them. Even though I try to write most of my academic papers in such a way where anybody should be able to pick it up and understand what I'm saying. A lot of academic areas don't do that. Sciences is just jam packed full of equations and acronyms, and in the arts they get very flamboyant with their language, where you need a PhD in English to understand what the hell they're talking about.
Yeah, that's right.
So I was trying to find that middle ground, where you can get complex ideas out, but anybody should be able to pick it up and read it, including people from the communities. And, communities are smart, but not everybody's an academic. And they should be able to pick up the papers and read them and understand what's going on. And they shouldn't be hit with the paywall. So I wasn't focusing on publishing all of my research in journals where you had to pay $50 an article to read it. How unethical would it be to work with a community who shares their knowledge with you and they have to pay to access their own knowledge? But with the book, I wanted to try to find a way that I could thread these narratives, and I liked themes, so having every chapter named after a different type of stellar phenomenon was a lot of fun. So the first one I wrote was on the variable stars. Then I wrote the one on the twinkling stars, which is another paper that I'd written about a year and a half after the variable star paper. And, I started thinking about what else can I do with these? They're starting to follow a theme. And it's not just, I could do on astronomical phenomena, which is basically what I did: planets, moon, sun, stars, meteors, whatever. Or I could have done themes like weather prediction, navigation, star maps. I could have done a multitude of different avenues of writing the book. But since it was about the science of the star knowledge, I thought I'll focus on the astronomy side, but to introduce areas that everybody would just be expecting. I didn't do a chapter on constellations because constellations are great. There's nothing wrong with that. And I talk about them, but I wanted to get into the science behind them. That's why we did the cataclysmic stars, the variable stars, twinkling stars, the wandering stars, about the planets and all the different cycles the planets go through, which are really difficult to work out. That was a great way for me to think about how I can get these topics across. So yeah, that's something I tried to do. I tried to put some funny anecdotes in there of things that happened. Everything in the book happened, by the way. Nothing in there is stuff I made up. And there were so many times when I'd be having conversations with people like I am with you, and I'd remember, oh, this funny incident happened when I was doing X, Y, or Z. I thought, well, do that in the book. Put these things in there. The chapter on navigational stars, I talk about how I got lost in the central desert and thought I was going to die with this old Czech geologist.
Yeah, actually, that was a terrifying story. I didn't realize there was going to be, life and death stakes involved in the book.
Neither did I.
Incredible surprise. You want to kind of tell that story a little bit?
Good friend and colleague of mine, Craig O'Neill, who's a geologist and planetary scientist. He invited me to come work with him, which I, funnily enough, not to digress too much, but I first met him in judo. We both trained in judo, so we're slamming each other. Well, he was slamming me around. Let's just be clear about that. And I was trying to choke him out. He was successfully choking me out. And then found out after a few months of training and beating the hell out of each other that he was an academic.
Wow.
And that we had a crossover in our interests. So, we became friends and colleagues. And there was a meeting of the Meteoritic Society. So this is the professional global society that studies meteorites and all the related phenomena. They had a meeting up in Cairns, and they were doing a post-conference excursion to the Central Desert. There's all kinds of meteorite craters out in the Central Desert. So he says, look, do you want to come along, help me out with everything, and then you can talk about some of the knowledge you've learned from communities about these? I'm like, yeah, that's great. Fully paid trip to go out there. Of course I'm going to do it. So we were doing that, and we're going all over the bush to these meteorite craters. And there's one crater called Kelly West. It's south of Tennant Creek, about halfway between Tennant Creek and Alice Springs. And it's like 20 Ks west of the highway. So we went down this dirt road that ran north-south, and we had to walk by foot 7 kilometers into the desert.
Wow.
To the giant asteroid crater, which you could barely see. It's exposed, as they say in geological terms. You could just see the rim of it, but it wasn't like the one you see in Arizona, So we get there with these giant four-wheel drive things. There's like 30 of us there, and everybody's getting ready. So Craig just sort of takes people and starts leading this convoy of people off into the desert, right? So I was going to bring up the back end of that. And there was this one geologist there in his 70s who, for whatever reason, decided that it was going to be okay to walk around in Spinifex country in shorts and flip-flops. Spinifex is this long, bushy kind of grass you see out in the desert, and the tips of that are like razors.
Like needles, yeah.
Like needles, like syringes. You're walking around the desert and just slicing you up. So they're going on. I'm holding, him and a couple of others at the very end. I'm like, all right, we need to go get them because they're starting to disappear into the bush. So I grabbed some water and we just take off. And I'm already like, I couldn't see them, but I could tell where they were, kind of. So I'm just trying to follow them, right? Sure. Well, they're this way. I'll just keep following until we catch up to them. And then, 20 minutes into this walk, I realized I didn't have a compass with me, didn't have a phone, didn't have anything. Like, that's okay. We're going to catch up with these guys. And then an hour goes by. We don't catch up with them. 2 hours goes by, and we're walking around. We're lost. And it's just me and the guy. He was partially deaf and couldn't speak. So he had a little notebook, and he could just understand English and write a little bit of it. He's in the Czech Republic, right? So I'm sitting here with this old guy who's oozing fluid from his legs in a rainbow of colors. We're lost out in the middle of the desert. Our water's disappearing. It's the middle of the day. I'm thinking, oh my God, what's going on? We're lost.
Yeah.
Kind of chatting. I'm trying not to panic because I don't want to freak him out or anything. I'm like, we'll be okay. And then I'm like, hang on. I'm an astronomer. We can figure this out. And he had a watch. I was like, what time is it? It's noon. I was like, perfect. So if it's noon, that means the sun's at the meridian. The sun's at the meridian, that means my shadow is facing exactly due south, right? So the road that we were driving down ran north-south. We'd been going west. So therefore, if I walk towards the east with the sun 90 degrees to my right, we're going to come across that road. And we walk and we walk and we walk, and I'm freaking out. We were out of water. We're starting to get really weary. I climb this tree trying to see if I can recognize a road. I can't see anything. I recognize a little forested area. We don't know what's going on. Keep walking, and about 20 meters away, there was the road. It was just an angle where I couldn't see it from the tree. And I jump out in the road, and I'm jumping up and down. I'm yelling at him like, the road. We're hugging each other, all sweaty and disgusting. And then I see other groups of people walking up from even further south than we are. They got lost as well. What happens when you're walking and you get lost, even though I was trying desperately to stay in a straight line, because I'm right foot dominated, I ended up walking in a giant loop, basically circle. So yeah, but I remember Les Bursell, that elder, is one who had mentioned to me when we were at the Royal National Park, you know where the sun is, because that's how you can navigate. And if the sun's high in the sky, that means it's around noon, your shadow's going to be pointing south, which I kind of remembered from, I kind of knew from my astronomy training, but he's the one who reiterated that in a big way. So that was quite a terrifying experience.
No doubt. And luckily you still, you weren't dehydrated and it kept your wits about you, put some navigation knowledge to practice there. They talk about an unforgiving environment. I mean, the stories of people going into the deep desert in Australia, never to be seen again. There are many of those.
What happens even outside Sydney? I mean, just in the Blue Mountains west of Sydney, people go walking down in the bushland there, and they've found people's bodies 20 meters away from the road.
Yeah, and just never knew the road was there. You include a lot of these stories, which are great, and they all tie in right back into the themes of the book. You mentioned at some point you're talking with an Indigenous knowledge holder, and they're explaining something to you, but they were doing it in this way that sort of revealed that they were giving you the preschool lesson. And you kind of called on, and you were like, oh, there are levels to this. You just don't get those levels the first time you meet someone. There's a system of transfer of knowledge, which is almost like an apprenticeship. You got to put your dues in, you got to put your time in. And if it's not your path, maybe you never get to those deeper levels.
That's right. So knowledge is power. Knowledge is very much power in these communities. It's very, very much the case. And knowledge is intellectual property. So the Yellows don't necessarily say it in that way, but for people these days to really get a grasp of it, it's their IP. You don't just give your IP away, right? You might allude to that. You start working with somebody, you build up a relationship, and you start sharing more information with them with the plan for mutual benefit, as they're doing with me. Yes, they're sharing knowledge with me, and I'm turning that, yes, I'm turning it into academic papers, which they approve and are authors on, but also what are the community outputs? The education curricula and the films and books and things. But when you're working with these communities, you're always aware there's much deeper levels of knowledge. So the way the communities work is, youth, when they reach a certain age, start being taught the deeper layers of that meaning. And they go through years of very intense instruction where they go through an initiation at the end, which is basically the graduation, which, will involve them performing the dances, singing the songs, and reciting the narratives and the stories verbatim as they were taught, which in some cases can take hours and hours and hours to recite
Wow.
the same story to make sure you get everything right. Because if that knowledge is inaccurate, it's not just inconvenient, it's deadly. You have to know what's going on. So you have to prove yourself intellectually, and you have to prove yourself physically. There's almost always some kind of physical component to this. You have to be a whole person. You can't just be a brainiac, and you can't just, be purely focused on the physical. You have to integrate those physical, mental, and spiritual worlds. And then there's multiple layers of knowledge as you go, further in life and get older and older, to where, the knowledge that's being shared is so important and so sacred that you have to make sure the people who are passing that and maintaining that, holding that knowledge, have earned their place. You have to make sure the right people have it. So there's all these protocols and restrictions on that, and that could include restricting it by levels of initiation or education or gender or things of that nature. So there's a lot of men's business and women's business and that kind of thing. So when I'm working, that's why they tend to put me with the men first, because it would be inappropriate to share women's business with me. But even men's business, we have to make sure everybody's, happy with that being shared publicly. So what happens with that process is most of everything in the book and what we talk about are the lower levels of knowledge, right? That's the public levels of knowledge. The deeper levels of knowledge tend to have those restrictions. And sometimes communities are happy to share that, but usually they only want to give small bits of that out. So that's when I was kind of getting around with this book, that even though there's a tremendous degree of knowledge that I talk about in the book, and a lot more that I don't talk about that I would like to, but I didn't have enough room because, there are page limits. There's the upper levels of all that knowledge that didn't even touch on, right? Which are much deeper. But that one time I was working with Uncle Ron Day and sort of wrapping everything up. And right as I turned everything off, and it was clear I wasn't taking notes or anything. He's like, "Oh yeah," and he just sort of reminds me of this, and he just sort of did this launch into some stuff really technical. So imagine you're like a high school student, you get a physics professor talking about advanced quantum theory or something. And all of a sudden, just sitting there like, "Oh my God, this is really detailed, incredible knowledge," knowing full well that I wasn't going to be able to write it down, but also knowing that it wasn't meant for me to write down. That he was sharing something with me, but it was also, there were multiple layers to why he was doing that. One of them was also to let me know and to remind me that no matter how enthusiastic you get and how excited you get, we're only sharing with you a tiny fraction of what we actually know.
Right.
This, I think, not only becomes an interesting challenge when you're doing this kind of research and trying to communicate it, but I also think it's one of the reasons the general public doesn't have a better respect or appreciation for these knowledges, because literally what they're told with the preschool and kindergartner version.
Sure. Yeah.
Stuff. So they see all that and they think, "Oh, well, this is kind of a kindergarten level." They think that's what it is. It's like, no. We're literally teaching you the kindergarten. We've got the more advanced stuff, but that's not necessarily for us to show you. So people see the basics and they think that's all it is.
I got to a section in the book and I was, surprised and delighted to see some oceanography and meteorology and climate. The more you learn, the more it shouldn't be all that surprising, because all these things are connected, and they're connected intimately for indigenous people. It's about these careful observations over deep time. They get integrated into this like holistic worldview. Like there aren't silos of study like there are for you and I.
Well, that's exactly it. Everything has to have meaning and application. And it's about thriving and surviving. There's all kinds of applications to this. And this is one of the funny little topics, actually, that I get into debates with about my colleagues when we're looking at the academic side of this stuff. So it's easy to look at things like the sun going from solstice to solstice throughout the year. Okay, well, that's how you measure a solar year. Or the moon going through phases and its length with tides, right? That's practical knowledge. We can all think of easy ways that could be applied. But you'll look and there'll be discussions about variable stars. So stars that slowly change in brightness over time, whether it's two stars moving in front of each other and one dimming the other one out for a brief period of time, or whether it's something intrinsic about the star. Some supergiant stars will expand and then contract. When they expand, they become brighter. Or even things like an eclipse or the lunar standstills. Like the moon does its own version of the solstice every month, but over a course of 18 years, waxes and wanes about how far apart those lunistices are. Well, it'd be easy for academics to say, well, there's no practical application for that. So why would cultures be interested? They wouldn't be. They don't care about that kind of stuff. That's something we're looking at. And I'm like, no. The meaning of that doesn't necessarily have to be something that ties to calendars or food economics or something, or predicting the weather. It can mean whatever the communities decide it means. So the stories that talk about stars changing in brightness, those brightness changes are not on a cycle that synchronizes with the solar calendar or a lunar calendar or a seasonal calendar. So they don't have that kind of practical function. But people still noted these stars change in brightness over time. So they attributed meaning to that was more personal. So they described like, one character was breaking a sacred taboo and was punished for it. And so that star changing in brightness reminds you of the activity that he did that he wasn't supposed to. So it has social meaning to it.
Which reinforces a law which has some other purpose in society.
Exactly.
Which all contributes to survival.
Exactly. We talk about eclipses, and the Torres Strait Islanders were able to predict eclipses, and that's something that no oral-based culture has been given credit for anywhere in the world. We know the Maya did it, the Sumerians did it, and a few other cultures did it, but they had some kind of physical writing system, like a structured written language.
Yeah.
But cultures that were orally based were never given credit. And even when I say the Islanders did that, people still scoff at me today. Prove it. Well, as they say, the proof is in the pudding. They have a whole ceremony that is planned in advance that only takes place during an eclipse. And they didn't come up with this ceremony to try to impress a bunch of astronomers. I mean, that's absurd. These ceremonies, recorded when the first people, first Europeans came to that part of the world. But what I'm getting at is like, well, what's the practical application of observing an eclipse? Well, let's put yourself in one of these big civilizations like you might see in China, India, Mesoamerica, someplace like that, right? And some of these places you have big, powerful kings. And these kings hold this position of extreme power. And as is very common, astronomical goings on had significant importance. They would, like in astrological terms, they could tell you something about your future. Eclipses were seen as a very powerful omen. They've literally stopped battles during eclipses because they saw it as a sign from the gods or something like that. So if you're a powerful king and you want to know if an eclipse is going to come up, because that's going to influence something you should be doing, or the influence of the people, or religious influence, your court astronomers had damn well better predict that eclipse accurately, because if they do, great. If they don't, they're probably going to walk around without a head, right?
Right.
Death is the result of that. So your ability to do that is not so much based on, is it calendars or is it finding food? It's based on life or death because this powerful person says so. So, this is one of those discussions I have with other academics about what this means and why it's important. But you can clearly see it in these traditions. People observed the most rare types of transient phenomena and difficult to predict types of phenomena, like eclipses. They did that.
Amazing.
And the evidence for it is as clear as anything else. And those are the kinds of things I really wanted to emphasize in this book. And to give a little bit of context, I gave a talk for an education conference in the middle of this year, for physics teachers. And I decided, instead of talking about eclipses and the solstice and things that they would easily recognize, I wanted to bring up something that was going to be a little bit more of a challenge for them. So I brought in eclipses. I talked about this Torres Strait ceremony and what it means, and how this ceremony was only performed during eclipse, but it had to be planned months in advance. It not only was planned months in advance, it was the top level of initiation for the traditional Zugabal Mabaig, which means starman or star astronomers. It was their top level of initiation to be able to predict when this was going to happen, right? So I said, how do you predict an eclipse? Let's just do a lunar eclipse. How are you going to predict that? And I led them step by step through the process of how you're going to predict a lunar eclipse. And even the physics teachers were starting to feel a bit lost. And that was deliberate, because it's easy to think, and I think it happens a lot, because people don't know what they don't know. I did that on purpose because I wanted them to feel a bit lost. I wanted them to realize this is not something easy. And the calendars did something incredibly difficult. And even they, as physics teachers, were going to struggle to do this. That's a little bit better of a way of getting people to understand the complexity and depth of this knowledge.
And one of the cases of priority that you talk about in the book that was striking to me, I think was it the variable brightness of Betelgeuse?
So there's a very famous song line that goes across the entire continent called the Seven Sisters song line, after the Pleiades. And a song line is a sung map in the landscape where you associate memory to place, something called the method of loci. So as you're traveling these routes across the country, you're singing the song, and the song is describing the land around you and where things are and what's happening. So as you're traveling over long distances, you're singing the song. It's reiterating these things. Even if you've never traveled the route before, the map is embedded in memory. Mm-hmm. You're reciting through the song. And if you cross into another country, another Aboriginal area, the song changes languages. There's a very famous one that goes all the way across the country, from WA to New South Wales coast, about the Seven Sisters. And in this narrative, it's talking about the Sisters of the Pleiades and their interaction with a man called, various names, Wati Niru Nairuna, who is represented by Orion. And he's chasing those sisters across the landscape. And it's this dynamic of what it all means and why they're doing it. Orion's chasing the Seven Sisters, but their eldest sister is protecting her younger sisters by standing between them and this man in Orion. And she's the stars of the Hyades, that V shape of stars, which we see as the horns of Taurus the bull in Greek tradition. And she's sort of taunting him and getting his attention away from the girls, her younger sisters, and towards her. And then she's like mocking and humiliating him because he's this cowardly womanizer. Throughout the actions of what she does to him, they're throwing fire magic back and forth. But he creates a fire magic in his right hand, which is the star Betelgeuse. Now, people thinking, well, hang on, Betelgeuse in the southern hemisphere is underneath, so that means he'd be upside down. He is. The elders community say he's upside down. Central part of New South Wales, they say he was, this particular individual was hunting a kangaroo and he tripped and fell over the horizon. He creates a fire magic and he's trying to throw it at her to get her out of the way so he can get to the sisters. And then she creates fire magic in her left foot, which is the star Aldebaran. She kicks fire magic back in him. And it kind of goes back and forth. And they describe the stars getting hotter and brighter and then going back down again. They're describing these stars changing in brightness over time, mostly with a focus on Betelgeuse. And of course, if you're an astronomer and you know anything about variable stars, which is what I did my master's degree on, you recognize Betelgeuse is a supermassive star that changes in brightness over time. On a period of about 400 days, it goes by, I think, 1.5 full magnitudes. So it changes noticeably. And the people recognize that. And they incorporated that into their oral traditions. And then, Westerners recorded this, those particular stories, early 1900s. But they didn't know anything about, these anthropologists and people writing this down, they didn't know anything about variable stars. They didn't describe in those terms. They just described these stars getting hotter and brighter, and they kind of mentioned their brightness changing, but they didn't quite know what that meant. So going in and doing the research is like, oh, this is what they're talking about. With the eyes of an astronomer, it's obvious. It's clear as day what they're talking about. And when I published a paper on that, there were a lot of people who were quite excited. Even the president of the American Variable Stars Association, global organization for that, personally emailed me and said they loved it. But I got a lot of pushback from amateur astronomers, not a lot of them, just a few of them, who thought that this is ridiculous. Aboriginal people didn't observe variable stars, rah, 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 rah. And no matter how much I tried to explain in detail the traditions and how they work and why it all could be done, they just didn't believe me. And then about a year later, I don't know if you remember this one back in 2019, 2020, just before COVID hit, Betelgeuse went through a really bizarre time called the Great Dimming, where it dropped from being the 11th brightest star to like the 22nd brightest star or something. It was noticeably fainter. So it's sort of put on a global stage. This does happen. You can see with your own eyes. Step outside now. You can see it,
Yeah, because part of the argument was that there wasn't enough change to be able to detect it with the human eye.
Yeah, and you clearly, what that means is about every 6 to 7 months, if you look at it 6 or 7 months apart, you're going to notice a significant change in the brightness of the star. Well, not significant, but 1.5 magnitudes is pretty noticeable. But what you need are nearby stars for comparison.
Uh-huh.
If you have an isolated star in the sky like Canopus, it's hard to judge brightness changes in Canopus because there's no other bright stars around, and it's the second brightest star anyway. But in something like Orion, you've got lots of stars around of comparable brightness where the human eye is really good at detecting changes in brightness. So if you were to ask people to list the 5 brightest stars in Orion, the majority of people will get it bang on, right? Because we're able to do that quite easily. So you had to have those stars, but you have there. And that just was a great way of showing how that worked. And then we found more evidence in other cultures. But the one that I'll finish on real quick is after the paper was published, I sent it to one of my PhD students at the time. And he said, "You're not going to believe this." I was like, "What?" And he actually calls me up. I was on the train in Sydney at the time. He calls me up. He says, "Just 4 days ago, I was sitting with the senior elder down outside Canberra who was talking. And in their cultures, they talk about how there was a community who had been attacked by another one. There's only a handful of them left. And they actually ascended into the sky. And the father ascended into the sky. He was pulled up by the younger kids. And he had an injury signifying blood. And the elder says, 'Oh, that star changes today. It pulsates slowly.'"
Wow.
Now, Bob didn't mention, the PhD student, Bob Fuller, who's now Dr. Fuller, didn't mention anything to the elder about variable stars. That wasn't something that was brought up or described. Didn't even know about the paper I was writing. Just totally serendipitously, another community talking about that star changing, but the elder literally saying this star pulsates slowly. So right from the horse's mouth, not even from something that was written down 100 years ago or something,
It set back the discovery of that for thousands of years, right? Which is just an incredible thing. Maybe now is a good time to return to the cover image on the book.
Absolutely. So when it came time to figure out what the cover was going to look like, the publisher, was like, "Look, we're open for ideas. What do you want to do?" And I really thought about this, and the obvious choice would seem to be an astronomy-related cover, maybe an Aboriginal artwork or something. And I thought, well, hang on. I've got lots of experiences with the elders, and there was one that I really liked, and that was with Uncle Segar Passy. So Segar Passy is the senior elder on Mare. He's in his 80s. He's a world famous artist. There's a few other artworks of his in that middle bit where the color images are. You can see some of those. He doesn't do an old, what you think of as a traditional design. He's got his own artistic style, and he's got a beautiful palette of colors he uses. I love it. But what I thought of was a time when I was sitting with him on Mare in his art studio, which the community built for him, which is really nice. He had some artworks on the wall, and we were chatting at the time about how both of us love sunsets. For both of us, it's our favorite time of the day. And he was sitting on his front porch where his studio is, and he'd sit there in a lawn chair, and he was talking about how he would be watching the sun throughout the year. He'd see where it was setting relative to the houses and the light pole and things across the street. He was noticing that. And he explained to me that he had this artwork which showed the sunset, and it just dawned on me that's the perfect image. First off, I want it for exactly the reason that you noted. It catches the eye.
Yeah,
right?
it pops. Yeah.
First thing, it pops out. You need something that's going to pop out. that's going to be an indigenous artwork, but isn't going to be one everybody automatically associates. This is not a dot painting, for example.
Sure.
Which most people think of when they think Aboriginal art, they think of dot paintings, right? The significance behind that is when you're looking at astronomy from an indigenous perspective, it's not, doesn't start when the stars come out. It's when the sun sets. Where does the sun set on the horizon? What time does it set? What do the clouds in the background look like? It's going to tell you about the weather or the climate conditions. So I thought, here's something. We both love sunsets. This is the time when you want to start doing it. You know, I bumper the book with all the stars in the middle, but on the edges is the sunrise, the sunset kind of thing. It's a great image that's going to pop out. It's one of the co-authoring senior elders who's on there. Everything just worked out beautifully. We got that art design and sent it to him, and he loved it. He absolutely loved it, and he was so happy to have that on there.
Yeah, what an incredible artist. Like he's capturing the details in a way, the way that he observes, right? The stuff that he pays attention to, the appearance of the sea surface, the colors in the sky. So it's gorgeous and it has so many meanings. I just thought it was really powerful. And the more you learn about it, the cooler it gets.
That's exactly right. And the thing about all of his artworks, which I keep looking over here, I've got these artworks lined up on my wall that are from his. And the first one there is of actually the one of the book cover. Every brush stroke, every color, every single time his brush touches that painting, it has meaning.
Wow.
Telling you something. They're filled with meaning. They're gorgeous because the scenery up there is gorgeous. You know, he's a great artist, but they're all localized. They're all from his community, which is mostly on Dawar, one of the two little islets off the coast of Mer. And it's just stunning, but everything with his artwork tells you something important. That's the thing that I think people, when they're interested in indigenous art, especially they want to buy a piece, it's not just about the aesthetics. Yes, of course, it's an artwork. Aesthetics is a big part of it, but it's about the meaning and what it's telling you, which is one of the things I love about the artworks, but I hate when I go into a big art shop in the middle of a city where the only thing it tells you the artist, the name of the artwork, and then like, oh, these are the dimensions and it's this kind of canvas or something, but it doesn't tell you the meaning of it.
Like you said, with the dot style artwork, it seems so abstract. So if you don't catch the meaning behind it, you're kind of missing most of the point of it.
Exactly right.
Yeah. So one other topic I wanted to hit is meteorite impacts. I know this is a favorite topic of yours. It's a chapter in the book. You touched on it like right in the beginning, but traveled out for one of these documentaries to one of the big meteorite crater sites where the scene of one of the indigenous creation stories.
That is from the Western Aranda people. So the Aranda people are the communities around Alice Springs, right in the central desert. And there is a gigantic asteroid crater about 130 kilometers west of Alice Springs. The Western term for it is Goss's Bluff. The Aranda term for it is Norala. And what you see today is the remnants of the central uplift of this giant complex crater. So what happened in terms of science, geology, is about 142 million years ago, a rather large asteroid, probably on the order of a kilometer in diameter, impacted, created this giant crater about 22 kilometers wide. Now, over the last 140 million years, that central part of Australia has eroded down. The ground used to be 2 kilometers higher than what it is now. So over 140 million years, the ground is eroded away by 2 kilometers. And what happens with these really big impacts that are over about 3.4 kilometers wide is you form what are called complex craters. So simple craters, the bowl-shaped craters. Complex ones look kind of flat. And what happens with those is just like when you drop a drop of water, in glass, you see it kind of go down, the middle part comes back up again. The sort of conservation principle of energy, right? Well, the ground does the same thing. So it kind of rebounds and comes back up. What happened over 140 million years ago was the ground eroded down, but the area where the central uplift was more dense. So it didn't erode as fast as the land around it. So what you see nowadays is this ring-shaped mountain range. It's 5 kilometers wide and about 150, 200 meters high. That's the central uplift. You look at a satellite image, you can see the wider 22 kilometer crater, but now you just see this ring-shaped mountain range. This mountain range is called Norla. Now, in the Aranda traditions, the Western Aranda traditions, from the Malbunkas, who were the traditional custodians of that story, they talk about how in the creation time, at the very beginning, there were a group of women who were dancing in the Milky Way as stars. And one of the women who had had a baby, she put the baby down in a turna, a kulemin, a wooden basket, down at the edge of the Milky Way. And while they were dancing to corroborate the ceremony, the vibrations shook it, and the baby slipped and fell off the Milky Way and came crashing down to the earth. It hit the ground, and the turna fell on top of it, and it pushed all the rocks around it upwards. Now, the baby's parents are the morning star and the evening star, and they take turns back and forth searching for their lost child to this day. It was said that parents out in the desert would tell their children, don't stare at the morning star or the evening star, Venus, when it's visible in the morning or the evening, because that's the baby's parents, and they'll think that maybe you're the lost child and they'll come take you away. So I did this documentary for National Geographic. It was called The Story of God with Morgan Freeman. And they wanted me to work with them as a consultant on an episode called Creation. And they wanted to do something in Australia. And I said, well, how about we do this? They contacted me and said, what are your ideas? Do you have anything? And I was like, yeah, well, here's a story out here, and this would be a great one to do. The filming team came down. We went out to the desert and we filmed this with Warren Williams, who is one of the traditional custodians. In fact, I think he's the CEO of the Central Land Council now. He's also a famous country musician. And when I went and visited him in Alice Springs, we were at the studios, and I mentioned I was a drummer, and he's like, oh, we've got a drum set in here. Do you want to go play it? And I was like, please. So first 5 minutes of me and this guy, I'm in the studio banging on a drum kit. We had a lot of fun with that. But he we were in the desert doing this filming. He was sharing knowledge with me about things I had researched before. I didn't know, but I suspected. And one of them, he says, if you look up high in the sky in what we think of as winter, when the Milky Way is straight overhead, you can see that turna still falling out of the Milky Way. It's a curve of stars, a U-shaped curve of stars called Corona Australis, which means southern crown. But to him, the traditions, that looks like that turna falling sideways out of the Milky Way. So that was, he confirmed something that we'd been thinking there. So it was a really amazing experience to see that. And, millions and millions of people saw that. And that was their creation. That was where life came. That's where the first people came from, this impact of this star that fell, which mirrored the scientific explanation of that, was their creation story.
It's a beautiful story. And these are people of the stars, right? Like that's where they came from. Other books, if people want to go further or get deeper into your topic?
There's a whole load of things coming out now, which is fantastic. 2 Aboriginal colleagues of mine wrote a book at the same time called Astronomy Sky Country, Carly Noon and Crystal Dinopoli. We were both working on our books at the same time. Theirs has quite a different approach to it. But they speak more from their perspectives as 2 Gamilaroi women. And that's a great one to see. It's part of the First Knowledges series, which is, initially was only going to be 6 books. Now it's going to be double that. And I might actually be writing one of the final books in that.
Amazing. Yeah, I've actually seen those around. I haven't picked one up yet.
Yeah, I just had a meeting with a phone conversation with the chief editor just before we picked up the phone, or just before we had our meeting here. So that'll be a lot of fun. There's a lot of other books coming out on this topic. There is a great book called Lynn Kelly's books. That's ones I want to mention. Lynn Kelly has done books on memory and orality, and that gives all the context to how all this stuff works and why it works. The Memory Code, which talks about how all these famous archaeological sites work as memory palaces like Stonehenge and things like that. And her work is solid. It's revolutionized archaeology. Memory Craft, which are the different techniques for memorizing stuff. Then there's the Knowledge Gene, which is the new one that just came out, where they worked out the actual gene within our DNA that gives humans the unique capacity for music and art that helps us be able to learn that thing. It actually what makes us human. That's a phenomenal book, and it just came out like a couple months ago here in Australia. It comes out in the US early in the new year. That's going to revolutionize everything. So those are great books to check. There's some other great books on Indigenous astronomy as well. Arctic Sky by John McDonald. It's all about Inuit astronomy from the
Oh,
Arctic,
cool. Yeah.
Alaska, Canada, Greenland, those areas. There's San Lozovici Rising, which is a great book. It's called The Spirit in the Sky, which is about Lakota knowledge. But of course, my colleague Annette Lee, who's a Lakota woman, an artist and an astrophysicist who I think has 7 degrees. She's writing some books and curricula. There's so much amazing stuff that's happening out.
One of the premises of the podcast is that science books can play a role in society in making positive change. So could you sum up what you hope people take away from your book?
There is a tremendous amount of things that we can learn from indigenous knowledges that are scientific. It doesn't matter that they're scientific. They shouldn't be considered valid because they're scientific. But there's amazing ways that we can learn from indigenous knowledges if we learn to close our mouths and open our ears. That's the main takeaway from all the work that I've been doing. There's research programs we're doing where elders are being involved in guiding astrophysics research because these worlds can inform each other in really remarkable ways. And we're not talking about astrology or something super esoteric. We're talking about real practical stuff too. So there's great synergies that are happening in this space. And now that we're working on, humanity's expanding its presence into space in a really rapid way, how can we work together to make sure that everybody benefits from this boom in the space industry? Also, how can we safeguard these knowledges so it's not being exploitative? How can we safeguard our view of the skies and darkness and still, move forward?
Yeah, given the history of colonial science, we have to keep that in mind.
Exactly right.
What about, you mentioned maybe a next book?
Whole load of new projects coming. As far as books, I just signed a book contract with Murdoch Books, which is part of Allen and Unwin, to write a sister companion to Marcia Langton's Welcome to Country. We're going to call it Welcome to Sky Country.
Wow.
And hoping to have that in by April, which means it'll come out a year later. We'll see how we go. A lot of stuff happening right now.
Is this she wrote the foreword in your book? Do I have that right?
My book. She did a phenomenal job, and she's extremely famous here in Australia. She's written tons of books and everything. She's the associate provost and foundation chair of Indigenous Studies here. She's an Iman woman from Queensland. She's pretty much needs no introduction for anybody in Australia. We got this amazing cultural and Indigenous astronomy program at the University of Melbourne going, and the new course is finally, the final course will be up and running first semester. So if you're still around, come join. It's called Astronomy and Society in the Space Age, and it's looking at all these questions about astronomy research and the space industry and all the philosophical and sociological questions we need to ask about that, with a bit of a focus on Indigenous rights and knowledges, but ties in with Indigenous astronomy, archaeoastronomy, and astronomy and world history, which are the other 3 courses. And then, of course, middle in July of next year, we have a major IAU-funded symposium for a week here at the university called Indigenous Astronomy in the Space Age, and it's going to be on this very topic.
Amazing. So where can people best find you and support your work?
You can go to aboriginalastronomy.com.au. That's a resource that our website I put together for all the educational resources and academic papers, that kind of thing. You can find us at Australian Indigenous Astronomy on social media, Facebook and Instagram. And you can find information about the book at thefirtastronomers.com.
Amazing. There's so much in the book. We didn't even scratch the surface. So if you're listening and you're enjoying the conversation, you really need to go out and buy the book. This has been Duane Hamacher. We've been talking about The First Astronomers, How Indigenous Elders Read the Stars, written by himself and elders and elder knowledge holders. Duane, thank you so much for your time. I think it was a really fun, incredible conversation. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Jeff, for having me on. I appreciate it.
Hey, Trip here. Thanks so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed the show, there are a few ways you can help us keep the conversation going. First, be sure to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. It really helps us connect with more listeners. If you can, also share the episodes with friends and family on social media. We also have a Patreon, so if you have the means, please consider supporting us directly. Patreon supporters get access to the book science community and bonus content only available for supporters. The Patreon is also a great place to get in touch, and we'd love to hear from you. So what books would you like to hear us cover next? Remember, you can find show notes and all things book science, as well as everything else I'm working on at tripcollins.com. Thanks for listening. I am Trip Collins, and this has been Book Science, your invitation to think deeply, stay curious, get off the scroll, and get out into the world. Take care.